Hello, darling. Lean in. Just a little closer. Yes, like that. Welcome to the soft side of horror. Tonight, we walk together through a house that remembers pain. The walls are tired. The air is fragile. And every shadow aches to be heard. But don't be afraid, darling. You are safe here with me. Always with me. Let the world fall quiet and your breath soften and feel the hush settle in your bones. Because this story, it's not loud. It's not violent. It is a sadness that whispers, a tragedy that trembles, a heartbeat fading into the dark. Welcome to the fall of the House of Usher. Are you ready, darling? Good. Let us begin. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soulless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy House of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of the half-pleasurable, because poetic sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decaying trees, with an utter desperation of soul which I can compare to no utterly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off to the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it? I paused to think. What was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the House of Usher? It was a mystery, all insoluble, nor could I grapple with the shadowy fancies that crowded upon me as I pondered. I was forced to fall back upon the unsatisfactory conclusion that while, beyond doubt, there are combinations of very simple natural objects that have the power of thus affecting us, still the analysis of this power lies among considerations beyond our depth. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify, or perhaps to annihilate its capacity for sorrow, impression, and acting upon this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, and gazed down, but with a shudder even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeled and inverted images of the gray sedge, and the ghastly tree stems, and the vacant eye-like windows. Nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom, I now proposed to myself a sojourn of some weeks. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in boyhood, but many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had lately reached me in a distant part of the country, a letter from him, which, in its wildly impromptu nature, had admitted of no other than a personal reply. The MS gave evidence of nervous agitation. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which opposed him, and of an earnest desire to see me as his best, and indeed his only, personal friend, with a view of attempting, by the cheerfulness of my society, some elevation of his malady. It was the manner in which all this, and much more, was said. It was the apparent heart that went with his request, which allowed me no room for hesitation, and I accordingly obeyed forthwith that I still considered a very singular summons. Although, as boys, we had been even intimate associates, yet I really knew little of my friend. His reserve had been always excessive and habitual. I was aware, however, that his very ancient family had been noted time out of mind for a particular sensibility of temperament displaying itself through long ages in many works of exalted art, and manifested of late in repeated deeds of munificent yet unobtrusive charity, as well as a passionate devotion to the intricacies, perhaps even more than the orthodox and easily recognized beauties of musical science. I learned, too, the very remarkable fact that the stem of the Usher race, all time honored as it had been, had put forth at no period any enduring branch. In other words, that the entire family lay in the direct line of descent, and had always, with very trifling and very temporary variation, so lain. It was this deficiency, I considered, while running over it in thought, the perfect keeping of the character of the premise with the accredited character of the people, and while speculating upon the possible influence which was one, it was the long lapse of centuries might have exercised upon the other. It was this deficiency, perhaps of collateral issue, and the consequent undeviating transmission from sire to son of the patrimony with this name, which had at length so identified the two as to merge the original title of the estate to the quaint and equivocal appellation of the House of Usher, an appellation which seemed to include, in the minds of the pleasantry who used it, both the family and the family mansion. I have said that the sole effect of my somewhat childish experiment, that of looking down within the tarn, had been to deepen the first singular impression. There can be no doubt that the consciousness of the rapid increase of my superstition, for why should I not so term it, served mainly to accelerate the increase itself. Such I have long known is the paradoxal law of all sentiments, having error as a basis, and it might have been this reason only that when I again uplifted my eyes to the house itself, from its image to the pool, there grew in my mind a strange fancy, a fancy so ridiculous, indeed, that I but mention it to show the vivid force of the sensations which opposed me. I had so worked upon my imagination as really to believe that about the whole mansion and domain where hung an atmosphere peculiar to themselves and their immediate vicinity, an atmosphere which had no affinity with the air of heaven, but which had reeked from the decaying trees and the gray wall and the silent tarn, a pestilent and mystic vapor, dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden-hued. Shaking off from my spirit what must have been a dream, I scanned more narrowly the real aspect of the building. Its principal feature seemed to be that of excessive antiquity. The discoloration of ages has been great. Minute fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in a fine tangled webwork from the eaves. Yet all of this was part from my extraordinary dilapidation. No portion of the masonry had fallen, and there appeared to be a wild inconsistency between its still perfect adaptation apart from the crumbling condition of the individual stones. In there was much that reminded me of the spacious totality of old woodwork which has rotted for long years in some neglected vault, with no disturbance from the breath of the external air. Beyond this indication of extensive decay, however, the fabric gave little token of instability. Perhaps the eye of a scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceivable fissure, which, extending from the roof of the building out in front, made its way down the wall in a zigzag direction until it became lost in the sullen waters of the tarn. Noticing these things, I rode over a short causeway to the house. A servant in waiting took my horse, and I entered the Gothic archway of the hall. A valet of stealthy step thence conducted me in silence through many dark and intricate passages in my progress to the studio of his master. Much that I encountered on the way contributed, I know not how, to heighten the vague sentiments of which I have already spoken. While the objects around me, while the carvings of the ceiling, the somber tapestries of the walls, the ebon blackness of the floor, and the phantasmagoric armorial trophies which read as I strode, were but matters to which, or to such as which, I had been accustomed from my infancy. While I hesitated not to acknowledge how familiar was all this, I still wondered to find how unfamiliar were the fancies which ordinary images were stirred up. On one of the staircases, I met the physician of the family. His countenance, I thought, wore a mingled expression of low cunning and perplexity. He accosted me with trepidation and passed on. The valet now threw open a door and ushered me into the presence of his master. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long, narrow, and pointed, and at so vast a distance from the black oaken floor as to be altogether inaccessible from within. Feeble gleams of crimson light made their way through the trellised panes and served to render sufficiently direct the more prominent objects around the eye, however, struggled in vain to reach the remoter angles of the chamber or to the recesses of the vaulted and fretted ceiling. Dark draperies hung from the walls. The general furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but failed to give any vitality to the scene. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow, an air of stern, deep, and irredeemable gloom hung over and pervaded all. Upon my entrance, Usher arose from a sofa on which he had been lying at full length, and greeted me with a vivacious warmth which had much in it. I at first thought of an overdone cordiality, of the constrained effort of the ennuyé man of the world. A glance, however, at his countenance convinced me of his perfect serenity. We sat down, and for some moments, which he spoke not, I gazed upon him with a feeling half of pity, half of awe. Surely man had never before so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the one being before me with the companion of my early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been at all times remarkable. A cadaverous of complexion, an eye large, liquid, and luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and very pallid, but of surpassingly beautiful curve, a nose of delicate Hebrew model, but with a breadth of nostril unusual in its similar formations, a finely molded chin, speaking in its want of prominence, of a want of moral energy, hair of more than web-like softness, ingenuity, those features with an inordinate expansion above the regions of the temple, made up altogether a countenance not easily to be forgotten, but now, in the mere exaggeration of the prevailing character of those features, and the other expressions they were wont to convey, so much of change that I doubted to whom I spoke. The now ghastly pallor of the skin, and the now miraculous luster of the eye, above all things startled and even awed me. The silken hair, too, had been suffered to grow all unheeded, and as in its wild gossamer texture it floated rather than fell from the face. I could not even with effort connect its as breath expression with my idea of simple humanity. In the manner of my friend, I was at once struck with an incoherence and inconsistency, and I soon found this to arise from a series of feeble and futile struggles to overcome a habitual trepidancy, an excessive nervousness, agitation. For something of this nature I had indeed been prepared, no less by his letter than by the remnants of certain boyish traits, and by conclusions deduced him from his particular physical confrontation and temperament. His actions were alternately vivacious and sullen. His voice varied rapidly from a tremulous indecision, then the animal spirits seemed uttered in abeyance, to that species of energetic concision that erupt weighty, unhurled, and hollow-sounding enunciation, that leaden self-balance and perfectly modulated guttural utterance, which may be observed in the last drunkard or the irreclaimable eater of opium during the periods of his most intense excitement. It was thus that he spoke of the object of my visit, of his earnest desire to see me, and of the solace he expected me to afford him. He entered at some length into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, a constitutional and a family evil, and one for which he despaired to find a remedy. A mere nervous affection, he immediately added, with undoubtedly soon pass off. It displayed itself in a host of unnatural sensations. Some of these, as he detailed them, interested and bewildered, although perhaps the terms and the general manner of the narration had its weight. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was alone endurable. He could wear only garments of certain texture. The odors of all the flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light, and there was peculiar sounds, and these were from stringed instruments, which did not inspire him with horror. To anomalous species of terror, I found him a bondman, a slave. I shall perish, said he. I must perish in the deplorable folly. Thus, and not otherwise, shall I be lost. I dread the events of the future, not in themselves, but in their results. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident, which may operate upon the intolerable agitation of the soul. I have indeed an abhorrence of danger, except in its absolute effect of terror to this unnerved and pitiable condition. I feel that the period will sooner or later arrive when I must abandon life and reason, together in some struggle with the grim phantasm fear. I learned, moreover, at intervals, and through broken and equivocal hints, another singular feature of his mental condition. He was enchained by certain superstitious impressions in regards to the dwelling which tenanted, and whence, for many years, he had never ventured forth in regard to an influence whose superstitious forces was conveyed in terms too shadowy here to be restated. An influence which some peculiarities in the mere form and substance of his family mansion had, by dint of long sufferance, he said, obtained over his spirits, an effect which the physic of grey walls and turrets, and of the dim tarn to which they all looked down on, had at length brought about upon the morale of his existence. He admitted, however, although without hesitation, that much of the peculiar gloom thus afflicted him could be traced to more natural and far more palpable origins, to the severe and long-continued illness, indeed, to the evidently approaching dissolution of a tenderly beloved sister, his sole companion for long years, his last and only relative on earth. Her decease, he said, with a bitterness which I can never forget, will leave him with the hopeless and the frail, the last of the ancient race of the Ushers. While he spoke, the Lady Madeline, for so was she called, passed slowly through a remote portion of the apartment, and without having noticed my presence, disappeared. I regarded her with an utter astonishment, not unmingled with dread, and yet I found it impossible to account for such feelings. A sensation of stupor oppressed me as my eyes followed her retreating steps. When a door at length closed upon her, my glance sought instinctively and eagerly the countenance of the brother. But he had buried his face in his hands, and I could only perceive that a far more than ordinary weariness had overspread the emaciated fingers, through which trickled many passionate tears. The disease of the Lady Madeline had long baffled the skills of her physicians. A settled apathy, a gradual wasting away of the person, and frequent, although transient, affections of a partially cataleptic character were the unusual diagnosis. Hitherto, she had steadily borne up against the pressure of her malady, and had not betaken herself finally to bed. But on the closing in of the evening of my arrival at the house, she succumbed, as her brother told me at night with inexpressible agitation, to the prostrating power of the destroyer, and I learned that the glimpse I had obtained of her person would thus probably be the last I should obtain. The lady, at least while living, would be seen by me no more. For several days, ensuring her name was unmentioned by either Usher or myself, and during this period, I was busied in earnest endeavors to alleviate the melancholy of my friend. We painted the reed together, or I listened as if in a dream to the wild improvisations of his speaking guitar, and thus, as the closer and still closer intimacy admitted me more unreservedly into the recesses of his spirit, and more bitterly did I perceive the futility of all attempts at cheering a mind from which darkness, as if an inherent positive quality, poured forth upon all objects of the moral and physical universe in one unceasing radiation of gloom. I shall ever bear about me a memory of the many solemn hours I thus spent alone with the master of the House of Usher. Yet I should fail at any attempt to convey an idea of the exact character of the studies or of the occupations in which he involved me, or led me the way. An excited and highly distempered ideally threw a sulphurous luster over all. His long improvised dirges will ring forever in my ears. Among other things, I hold painfully in mind a certain singular perversion and amplification of the wild air of the last waltz of von Weber, from the paintings over which his elaborate fancy brooded, and which grew, touch by touch, into vagueness, at which I shuddered, and more thrillingly, because I shuddered knowing not why. From these paintings, vivid as their images now are before me, I would in vain endeavor to induce more than a small portion which should lie within the compass of merely written words. By the utter simplicity, by the nakedness of his designs, he arrested and overawed attention. If ever mortal painted an idea, that mortal was Roderick Usher. For me, at least, in the circumstances then surrounding me, there arose one of the most pure abstractions which the hypochondriac contrived to throw upon his canvases, an intensity of intolerable awe, and no shadow of which felt I ever yet in the contemplation of the certainly glowing yet too concrete reveries of Fuseli. One of the phantasmagoric conceptions of my friend partaking not so rigidly in the spirit of abstraction may be shadowed forth, although feebly in words. A small picture presented the interior of an immensely long and rectangular vault of tunnel, with low walls, smooth, white, and without interruption or device. Certain accessory points of the design served well to convey the idea that this excavation lay at an exceeding depth below the surface of the earth. No outlet was observed at any portion of its vast extent, and no torch or other artificial source of light was discernible. Yet a flood of intense rays rolled throughout, and bathed the whole in a ghastly and inappropriate splendor. I have just spoken of that morbid condition of the auditory nerve which rendered all music intolerable to the sufferer, with the exception of certain effects of stringed instruments. It was perhaps the narrow limits to which he thus confined himself upon the guitar which gave birth, in great measure, to the fantastic character of his performances. But the fervid facility of his impromptus could not be accounted for. They must have been and were in the notes, as well in the words of his wild fantasies, for he not unfrequently accompanied himself with rhymed verbal improvisations. The result of that intense mental collectiveness and concentration, to which I have previously alluded, in particular moments of the highest artificial excitement, the words of one of these rhapsodies I have easily remembered. I was perhaps the more forcibly impressed with it as he gave it because, in the under of mystic current of its meaning, I fancied that I perceived that, for the first time, a full consciousness of the part of Usher, of the tottering of his lofty reason upon her throne. The verses, which were entitled "The Haunting Palace," ran very nearly, if not accurately, thus: "In the greenest of our valleys, by good angels tenanted, once a fair and stately palace, radiant palace, reared its head. In the monarchs throughout dominion it stood there. Never seraph spread opinion over fabric half so fair. Banners yellow, glorious golden, oh, its roof did float and flow. This, all this, was in the olden time long ago. And every gentle air was dallied in the sweet day. Among the rampart, plumed and pallid, a winged odor went away. Wanderers in the happy valley, though two luminous windows saw, spirits moving musically to a lute well-tuned law. Round about a throne, where sitting Porphyrion, in state his glory well befitting, the ruler of the realm was seen, and all with pearl and ruby glowing, with his fair palace door, through which came flowing, and sparkling evermore, a troop of echoes whose sweet duty was but to sing, in the voices of surpassing beauty, the wit and wisdom of their king. But evil things in robes of sorrow assail the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate, and round about his home the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the old times entombed, and travelers now within that valley, through the red linen windows, see vast forms that move fantastically to discontent melody, while like a rapid ghastly river through the pale door a hideous throng rush but forever, and laugh but smile no more. I remember the suggestions arising from this ballad led us into a train of thought wherein there became manifest an opinion of Usher's, which I mention not so much on account of its novelty, or rather men have thought thus, as an account on the pertinacity which he maintained. This opinion, in its general form, was that of the sentience of all vegetable things, but in his disordered fancy, the idea that assumed a more daring character and trespassed under certain conditions upon the kingdom of inorganization. I lack words to express the full extent or the earnest abandon of his persuasion. The belief, however, was connected, as I have previously hinted, with the gray stones of the home of his forefathers. The condition of the sentence had been there, he imagined, fulfilled in the method of concoction of these stones, in the order of their arrangement, as well as in the many fungi which overspread them, and one of the decayed trees which stood around, above all, in the long, undisturbed endurance of this arrangement, and in its reduplication in the still waters of the tarn. Its evidence, the evidence of the sentence, was to be seen, and I here started as he spoke. In the gradual, yet certain condensation of an atmosphere of their own about the waters and the walls, the result was discoverable. He added in that silent yet impromptu and terrible influence which for centuries had molded the destinies of his family, and which made him, I now saw him, which he was, such opinions of no comment, and I made none. Watson, Dr. Percival Spalzani, and especially the Bishop of Landolph. See Chemical Essays, Volume 5. Our books, the books which for years had formed no small portion of the mental existence of the invalid, were, as might be supposed, in strict keeping with their character of phantasm. We pored together over such works as the Breviary of Chartreuse, of Gresset, the Belferger of Macalvy, the Heaven, the Hell of Swedenborg, the Subterranean Voyage of Nicholas Klim of Holberg, the Trimoxy of Robert Flew, of Jean de Egnoun, and of de la Cham, the Journey into the Blue Distance of Tieck, and the City of the Sun of Compostela. Our favorite volume was a small octavo edition of the Dictatorium Inquisitorum by the Dominican Emeric de Giram, and there were passages in Pontus Mela about the old African sailors and O'Gibbons, over which Usher would be dreaming for hours. His chief delight, however, was found in the perusal of an exceedingly rare and curious book in quarto Gothic, the Manual of Forgotten Church, the Vigile Motorium Sacrarum Shorum Ecclesiae Magneti. I could not help but think of the wild ritual of his work, and of its probable influence upon the hypochondriac, when one evening, having informed me abruptly that the Lady Madeline was no more, he stated his intention of preserving her corpse for a fortnight, previously in its final interment, in which the numerous vaults within the main walls of the building. The worldly reason, however, assigned with this singular proceeding was one which I did not feel at liberty to dispute. The brother had been led to his resolution, so he told me, by consideration of the unusual character of the malady of the deceased, of certain obtrusion and eager inquiries of the part of her medical men, the remote and exposed situation of the burial ground of the family. I will not deny that when I called to mind the sinister countenance of the person whom I met upon the staircase on the day of my arrival at the house, I had no desire to oppose what I regarded be at best but a harmless and by no means an unnatural precaution. At the request of Usher, I personally aided him in the arrangements for the temporary entombment. The body having been encoffined, we two alone bore it to its rest. The vault in which we placed it, and which had been so long unopened that our torches, half smothered in this oppressive atmosphere, gave us little opportunity for investigation, was small, damp, and entirely without means of admission for light. lying at great depth immediately beneath a portion of the building, in which was my own sleeping apartment. It had been used, apparently in remote feudal times, for the worst purposes of the Don keep, and in later days as a place of deposit for powder or some other highly combustible substance as a portion of its floor, and the whole interior of a long archway through which we reached it was carefully sheathed with copper. The door of the massive iron had been similarly protected. Its immense weight caused an unusually sharp grating sound as it moved upon its hinges. Having deposited our mournful burden upon trestles within this region of horror, we partially turned aside the yet unscrewed lid of the coffin and looked upon the face of the tenant, a striking similitude between the brother and sister, now first arrested my attention, and Usher, divining perhaps my thoughts, murmured out some few words from which I learned that the deceased and himself had been twins, and that sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Our glances, however, rested not upon the dead, but we could not regard her unawed. The disease which has thus entombed the lady in the maturity of youth had left an unusual and all maladies of a strictly cataleptic character, of the mockery of a faint blush upon the bosom and face, and that suspiciously lingering smile upon the lips, which is so terrible in death. We replaced and screwed down the lid, and having secured the door of iron, made our way with toil to the scarcely less gloomy apartments of the upper portion of the house. And now, some days of bitter grief have elapsed. An observable change came upon the features of the mental disorder of my friend. His ordinary manner had vanished. His ordinary occupations were neglected or forgotten. He roamed the chamber to chamber and hurried unequal and objectless step. The pallor of his countenance was assumed, if possible, a more ghastly hue, but the luminous of his eye had utterly gone out. The once occasional huskiness of his tone was heard no more, and the tremulous quaver of its extreme terror habitually characterized his utterance. There were times, indeed, when I thought his unceasingly agitated mind was laboring with some oppressive sight of divulge which he struggled for the necessary courage. At times again, I was obliged and resolved all into the mere inexplicable vagaries of madness, for I beheld him gazing upon vacancy for long hours, and his attitude, the profoundest attention of it listening for some imaginary sound. It was no wonder that his condition terrified, that it infected me. I felt creeping upon me by slow yet certain degrees the wild influences of his own fantastic yet impressive superstitions. It was especially upon retiring in bed late in the night of the 7th or 8th day after the placing of the Lady Madeline within the donjon that I experienced the full power of such feelings. Sleep came not near my couch while the hours waned and waned away. I struggled to reason off the nervousness which had dominion over me. I endeavored to believe that much, if not all, of what I felt was due of the dark and tattered draperies which, tortured into motion by the breath of a rising tempest, swayed fitfully to and fro upon the walls, and rustled uneasily about the decorations of the bed. But my efforts were fruitless. An irrepressible tremor gradually preserved my frame, and at length there sat upon my very heart an incubus of utterly causeless alarm. Shaking this off with a grasp and a struggle, I uplifted myself upon the pillows, and peering earnestly within the intense darkness of the chamber, hearkened. I know not why, except with an instinctive spirit prompted me, to certain low and infinite sounds which came through the pauses of the storm at long intervals. I knew not whence, overpowered by an intense sentiment of horror, unaccountable yet unamendable, I threw on my clothes with haste, for I felt that I should keep no more during the night, and endeavored to arouse myself and the pitiful conditions to which I had fallen by pacing rapidly to and fro through the apartment. I had taken but a few turns in this manner when a light step on the adjoining staircase arrested my attention. I presently recognized it as the door and entered, bearing a lamp. His countenance was, as usual, cadaverously wan, but more so, there was a species of mad hilarity in his eyes, and evidently restrained hysteria in his whole demeanor. His air appalled me, but anything was preferable to the solitude which I had so long endured, and I even welcomed his presence as a relief. "Have you not seen it?" he said abruptly, after having stared about him for some moments in silence. "You have not seen it, then? But stay, you shall." Thus speaking, and having carefully shaded his lamp, he hurried in one of the casements and threw it freely upon the storm. The impetuous fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. It was indeed a tempestuous yet sternly beautiful night, and one wildly singular in its terror and its beauty. A whirlwind had apparently collected its forces in our vicinity, and there were frequently and violent alterations in the direction of the wind. Yet the exceeding density of the clouds, which hung so low as to press upon the turrets of the house, did not prevent our perceiving the life-like velocity which they flew, careering from all points against each other. Without passing away into the distance, I say that even their exceeding density did not prevent our perceiving this. Yet we had no glimpse of the moon or stars, nor was there any flashing forth of lightning, but the undersurface of the huge masses of agitated vapor, as well as the terrestrial objects immediately around us, were glowing in this unnatural light of a faintly luminous and distinctly visible gaseous exhalation which hung about the shrouded the mansion. "You must not, you shall not behold this," said I, shuddering to Usher as I led him with gentle violence from the window to a seat. "These appearances which bewilder you, your merely electrical phenomena, yet uncommon, or it may be that way, have their ghastly origins in the rank miasm of the tarn. Let us close this casement. The air is chilling and dangerous to your frame. Here is one of your favorite romances. I will read it, and you shall listen, and so we'll pass away this terrible night together." The antique volume which I had taken from the Mad Tryst of Sir Launcelot Canning, that I had called it a favorite of Usher's, more in sad jest than in earnest, for in truth there is little in this uncouth and unimaginative proximity which could have had interest for this lofty and spiritual ideal of my friend. It was, however, the only book immediately at hand, and I indulged a vague hope that the excitement which now agitated the hypochondriac might find itself relief, for the history of mental disorder is full of similar anomalies, even in the extremeness of the folly which I should read. Could I have judged indeed by the wild, overstrained air of ferocity with which he apparently hearkened, or the words of the tale, I might well have congratulated myself upon the success of my design. I had arrived at the well-known portions of the story where Ethelred, the hero of Trist, having sought in vain a peaceable admission into the dwelling of the hermit, proceeds to make good an entrance by force. Here it will be remembered the words of the narrative ran thus. And Ethelred, who by nature of a doughty heart, and who was now mighty withal, on account of the powerfulness of the wine which he had drunken, awaited no longer to hold a parley with the hermit, who in sooth was of obstinate and maleful turn, but feeling the rain upon his shoulders, the fearing rising of the tempest, uplifted his mace outright, and with blows made quickly room by the plankings of the door from his gauntleted hand, and now pulling therewith sturdily, her he so cracked and ripped and tore all asunder, at the noise of the dry and hollow sounding wood, illumined and reverberated throughout the forest. At the termination of this sentence I started for the moment paused, and it appeared to me, although I at once concluded that my excited fancy had deceived me, it appeared to me that from some very remote portion of the mansion there came in distinctly to my ears what might have been, in its exact similarity of character, the echo, but a stifled and dull one certainly, of the very cracking and ripping sound which Sir Lancelot had so particularly described. It was beyond doubt and coincidence alone which had arrested my attention, for amid the rattling of the sashes of the casements and the ordinary commingled noises of the still increasing storm, the sound in itself had nothing, surely, which should have interested or disturbed me to continue the story. But the good champion Ethelred, now entering within the door, was soon sore engaged and amazed to perceive no signal of the malicious hermit, but in the steel thereof a dragon of a scaly and prodigious demeanor, and of a fiery tongue, which sat in the guard before the palace of gold, with a floor of silver, and upon the walls there hung a shield of shining brass, with this legend written on it: Who entereth herein a conqueror hath been, who slayeth the dragon, this shield he shall win. And Ethelred uplifted his mace, and struck upon the head of the dragon, which fell before him, and gave him his pasty breath, with a shriek so horrid and harsh, and withal so piercing, that Ethelred had fain to close his ears with his hands against the dreadful noise of it, like the whereof was never before heard. Here again I paused abruptly, and now with a feeling of wild amazement, for there could be no doubt whatever that in this instance I did actually hear, although from what direction it proceeded I found it impossible to say, a low and apparently distant, but harsh, protracted, and most unusual screaming of grating sound, the exact counterpart of what my fancy had already conjured up for the dragon's unnatural shriek as described by the romancer. Oppressed as I certainly was upon the occurrence of this second and most extraordinary coincidence, by 1,000 conflicting sensations in which wonder and extreme terror were prominent, I still retained sufficient presence of mind to avoid exciting by my observation the sensitive nervousness of my companion. I was by no means certain that he had noticed the sounds in question, although assuredly a strange alteration had, during the last few minutes taken place in his demeanor. From a position fronting my own, he had gradually brought about his chair, as though it was sitting with his face to the door of the chamber, and thus I could but partially perceive his features, although I saw that his lips trembled as if he were murmuring inaudibly. His head had dropped upon his breast, yet I knew that he was not asleep, from the wide and rigid opening of his eyes as I caught a glance of his profile. The motion of his body, too, was at variance with this idea, for he rocked from side to side with a gentle yet constant and uniform sway. Having rapidly taken notice of all this, I resumed the narrative of Sir Lancelot, with thus proceed. And now the champion, having escaped from the terrible fury of the dragon, bethinking himself of the brazen shield, of the breaking of the enchantment which was upon it, removed the carcass from out of the way before him, and approached valorously over the silver pavement of the castle to where the shield was upon the wall, which in sooth tarried, not for his full coming, but fell down upon his feet, upon the silver floor, with a mighty, great, and terrible ringing sound. No sooner had these syllables passed my lips, than, as if a shield of brass had indeed, at that moment, fallen heavily upon the floor of silver, I became aware of a distinct, hollow, metallic, and clangorous, yet apparently muffled reverberation. Completely unnerved, I leaped up to my feet, but the measured rocking movement of Usher was undisturbed. I rushed to the chair in which he sat. His eyes were bent fixed before him, and throughout his whole countenance there reigned a stone rigidity. But as I placed my hand upon his shoulder, there came a strong shudder over his whole person. A sickly smile quivered about his lips, and I saw that he spoke in a low, hurried, and gibberish murmur, as if unconscious of my presence. Bending closely over him, I at length drank in the hideous import of his words. Now hear it? Yes, I hear it. And you have heard it long, many minutes, many hours, many days. Have I heard it? Yet I dared not. Oh, pity me, miserable wretched that I am. I dare not speak. We have put her living in the tomb. Shall I not, that my senses were acute? I tell you that I heard her first feeble movements in the hollow coffin. I heard them many days ago, yet I dare not speak. And now, tonight, Ethelred, after breaking the hermit's door and the death cry of the dragon and the clangor of the shield, say rather than rendering of her coffin, and the grating of the iron hinges of her prison, and her struggles within the coppered archway of the vault, oh, whither I shall fly. Will she not be there tomorrow? Will she not be here? Is she not hurrying to upbraid me for my haste? Have I not heard her footsteps on the stairs? Do I not distinguish that heavy and horrible beating of her heart? Madman! Here he sprang furiously to his feet and shrieked out his syllables as if in the effort that he were giving up his soul. Madman! I tell you that she now stands within the door. As in the superhuman energy of his utterance, there had been found the potency of a spell. The huge antique panels to which the speaker pointed threw slowly back upon the instant, the ponderous and ebony jaws. It was the work of the rushing gust, and then, without those doors, there did stand the lofty and enshrouded figure of the Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood upon her white robes, and the evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold. Then, with a low moaning cry, fell heavily inward upon the person of her brother, and in her violent and now final death agonies, bore him to the floor a corpse and a victim to the terrors he had anticipated. From that chamber and from the mansion I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath as I found myself crossing the old causeway. Suddenly there shot along the path a wild light, and I turned to see hence a gleam of unusual which was issued, for that vast house and the shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting of the blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through that once barely discernible fissure, of which I have spoken as extending from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction to the base. While I gazed, this fissure rapidly widened. Then there came a fierce breath of the whirlwind, the entire orb of the satellite at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was long, tremulous shouting, like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and dank tarn at my feet closed suddenly and silently over the fragments of the House of Usher. Hush now, darling. Do you feel it? The house has fallen. Its sorrow spilled like ink into the quiet earth, and yet the story lingers, like breath against your neck, like fingertips brushing memory. Tragedy doesn't scream, it sighs, and it clings, soft and cold, the way longing always does. Their hearts broke, their mind withered, and in the end, even the walls could no longer bear it. But you're still here, warm, breathing, listening in the dark with me. And oh, darling, what a beautiful thing to survive a sorrow like this. Rest now. Let the quiet settle in your bones. Let the story melt low and sweet, like candles upon your spine. When next we wander into another forgotten shadow, another haunted heart, come back to me. I'll be waiting in the hush between heartbeats. Good night, darling. And remember, even ruin can be exquisite when we face it together.